darkest roads and up in the clouds, but I've always felt that something's missing. That was until I found you right there in the crowd. You came into my life and started a fire. You made me feel like I could touch the sky. Oh, there's nothing missing now that you're my desire. Now all I have to do is to make it mine. 'Cause I know, and you know what we could be. Like a song, like a perfect melody. Baby, don't say you don't believe in me. 'Cause you know, and I know, we're onto something good. You know, and I know, we got something good.
Hello, hey, how's it going? Bonnie Violet here. I'm a trans femme, genderqueer, spiritual drag artist, and digital chaplain. And in case you don't know where you are, you have found yourself at Say Something Sundays. And today's topic is healing through grief and loss. If you've never happened across one of these before, basically once a week, I just take some time and say what's on my heart and on my mind or in my mind or however on a certain topic that's kind of been just kind of loud in my life of late, or seems like something worth talking about. And so today I thought I would take some time to talk about grief and loss. I think grief and loss is a very human experience. It's probably what makes us human and not God, maybe. Some people might say that. I don't know if they believe in such a thing, but and grief and loss comes in many forms. I did put a link in the description to a podcast that you might like to check out later with a new friend of mine, Kaylee, talking about her work as a grief counselor. If you're interested in learning a little bit more from that, it's a really great link. And one of her definitions that she uses for grief is, I define grief as the natural, normal response to something being taken from you without your permission, which I just thought was kind of an interesting way of putting it. And again, you can find that link in the description. I'm also going to add a couple of videos that, grief and loss, there are many ways that we can kind of, I think, cope and or kind of work through grief and loss. And I have actually utilized my drag a lot to my drag performance. I'm not typically much of a stage performer, but when I do drag, I tend to have some sort of I tend to be going through some sort of process for me, which oftentimes has been centered around my identity and around kind of grief and loss. I think grief and loss is not something, I think when we think of grief and loss, we automatically think of, people dying. But we deal with grief and loss a lot. As you may or may not know, I identify as a queer chaplain. And as a queer chaplain, so chaplains are typically with people around death and dying, usually in the physical body. So oftentimes you'll hear a chaplain in the army or at a hospital, or maybe they serve at a church. And chaplains, again, they're usually just people who are unbiased in the sense they're not impacted by what you're going through, i.e. you're not like a family member or a loved one of the individual who is going through this process of death and dying. And it's not always just for the person who is dying, but also like the family or loved ones that are part of that as well. And so what a chaplain does is they are just another person for that individual, to hold space for that individual to talk about their fears and their concerns, which are often sometimes very difficult to share with family members or loved ones who are impacted by what you're going through, your death. I think sometimes we feel like we have to be strong, or we have to put on a show, or there are some things that we think and that we're going through that might actually hurt another person's feelings or experience if we are completely honest about maybe some of the things that we're going through. And so chaplains can really serve as as just another person to hold space. Spirituality is often a part of this experience, and the spirituality isn't about like the chaplain spirituality. It's meant to be about your spirituality, the one who is going through the grief for the loss. Um, so it's kind of like, how do you inviting what your religious understanding or God concept or beliefs or purpose or whatever it is that you've come to understand or believe for yourself, and kind of being able to help you tap in that for either strength or understanding or comfort, as you kind of go through that process, maybe clarity as well. And so I typically, as a chaplain and as a queer chaplain, I feel called to be with people around death and dying to self, which is more around like identity, and maybe more of mind. I think it is part of, and spirit potentially. And so so what I like to do is I like to be present with people through that process of, identity shift. When we have an identity shift, we have to die to who we were in order to become who we are, or who we would like to be. And so oftentimes as queer LGBTQ folks, people dealing with addictions, I mean, there are so many identities that we might find ourselves in or come to know about ourselves that tell us, or maybe somebody else has told us, that we are no longer eligible to have God in that experience with us. And so what I like to do is invite people to see where their spirituality and their understanding of God, religion, whatever, could potentially be present, in a helpful way, in a comforting way, through their identity shift. James is saying that James ended a 4-year relationship. Not a lot of post breakup counseling available. Kaiser is not great at mental health. Yeah, so that's a great example. Great feels not quite right, but that's a good example of a loss or a grief, that's not that can be difficult for us to kind of go through. And I think grief counseling is not something that you hear a lot of, but it's and I think the challenge with a lot of the things that become difficult to deal with grief and loss is isolation. Oftentimes we go through this loss, and this loss is so painful and so personal that it's really difficult. And oftentimes the people around us maybe aren't impacted by it in the same way. And so it can be super isolating. And, like with much things in our life, when things just live in our head, they tend to have a lot of power, especially if you're in kind of like a negative space or difficult space, which grief and loss is difficult. And it is important that you actually are able to grieve. Grieving is a very like healthy, normal kind of part of the healing process, of going through grief and loss. So, how do you deal with isolation? The big thing is being able to not be by yourself, and not be by yourself in that experience. I think is really important, because it doesn't do me any good for me. It may do me some good, just to not be by myself. However, in order, I think, to potentially work through the grief, you need to be able to really not be isolated through going through that grief. And again, that's not to say you're not going to have moments. I think there are very private, sacred moments that we experience with grief. When we break down, when we cry, when we scream at God, or we scream at like whatever, those can be fairly personal and sacred and important grieving processes, as we're going through grief. But it also can be helpful to have others go through that with you. And so sometimes, if, say, a family member had passed away, or is ill, or potentially in a place of dying, then you might have like a family of folks, that you could kind of tap into and talk with them through the process, which I think can be helpful to all parties involved. I don't want to say that like I'm an expert on this in any way, and because I'm not, I'm just really sharing what my experience is and what my understanding is of it today. Um, I have dealt with grief and loss throughout my lifetime in many different ways. Um, I, you know, I spent much of my childhood. I do not recall. I don't recall much up until the age of 12. Um, I had an incident in which uh, I stopped speaking for a while because of something that I witnessed that I don't even recall. Um, and so that might be one way of dealing with grief and loss, is like dissociation or um, loss of memory and whatnot. But the interesting thing that when I realized or felt like I am actually came back into my body and started having memories and recalling what life was all about was around the age of 12. And similarly, it was around the passing of my close friend, Jed, and my aunt, Tina. Had both passed away that summer that I was like 12. I think it was like 1992. And for whatever reason, I don't know if that experience, it kind of just brought me, I don't know, back in my body, um, brought me to pain. I do recall like crying and having a very difficult time, especially with my aunt in particular. I think, you know, my friend passed away first, and, you know, we all were in school together. And so I think grieving with like classmates and people that I weren't super close with made it really difficult for me to be able to cry or express what I was going through that process. I remember when my aunt passed away, though, I remember, you know, I just remember going to the viewing, and then I remember being at the funeral, and I wasn't really super close with my aunt. Like I said, so like my aunt was 23 and I was 12, and her passing was very tragic and just devastating and unexpected. And I remember like not wanting to leave the service. And I think for me, a lot of my grief was grieving what I didn't have or couldn't have with her anymore. And one of the things that I found myself doing is that I actually grieved my friend during that process as well. And I don't know that I think for me, oftentimes grief seems to accumulate over time where, you know, one thing will happen and then another thing will happen and another thing will happen. And sometimes if they happen in succession, I might go through a process of almost being numbed or almost cold or like I don't know, like just really disconnected with what I'm going through. And I think that's for me, it's because I'm often just overwhelmed by that process, and I don't always have the healthy. I don't know if healthy, but I tend to respond that way. It's really easy for me to shut down and close off, and really try to hide what I'm going through, even from myself. Having emotions, expressing emotions, having feelings scare the hell out of me. I don't have a lot of experience. It's weird. I do have experience, but I feel like I have newer experience, but it often freaks me out. I remember I feel like I've cried and expressed grief in ways in the last few years than in more extreme and intense ways than I thought I ever could or would. But so where am I at with that? So isolation can be really difficult, and it can be really difficult for us to find other people in which we can share what we're going through. If you're part of a spiritual community, grief and loss is a great discussion to have with your pastor or your deacon or somebody who's maybe a part of your spiritual community. It doesn't even have to be necessarily the pastor, but they could connect you with some sort of type of pastoral care, if that's something that you're into through this process. Oftentimes, many of us don't have access to therapy. We might not want to step foot, nor are we open to the idea of some sort of spirituality or spiritual setting or spiritual leadership, or spiritual collaboration through the experience, and that's okay. And so then that leaves us with the people around us. And sometimes that can be very satisfying and also unsatisfying. as and somewhere in between. Uh, Oftentimes, I think we can begin to share our grief and our loss with another person, and they don't know what to do with that. They are like no fucking clue. Many of us get awkward, and we don't know how much to talk about it. Like, do we say, oh, okay, yeah, like I think oftentimes um, we act shocked or even overwhelmed. I know oftentimes I have felt that way when people share things with me that maybe I wasn't expecting. Um, and then I'm just kind of stunned and unsure of how to proceed. And sometimes it is okay just to hold stillness, and to not really say much. And other times it might be helpful to say things, and I think it's really important to not. It's so difficult, and I think it's really important that it's like a part of me feels like it's really important that you share your grief and loss with somebody who knows you really intimately, which I think can be really helpful in the sense of that they may be able to know kind of how to comfort you through that process because they've done it before. There also might be some advantage to potentially talking with someone who maybe doesn't know as much about you, because they also might be able to kind of have a little bit more distance from what you're going through, and maybe even be more equipped to be present with you in a way that is helpful to you. Being on the other end of that shock, it can be a little unnerving, but also I think it's just an authentic expression that many of us kind of go through. I There's so much to like talk about, and I did like take some notes here for folks who are listening and watching. If you have any like specific questions, feel free to put them in the comments now, or some or a prompt of what you'd like for me to speak more to. That would be really great. One of the things that I wanted to, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around, but I wanted to kind of point out my makeup. I intentionally wore makeup this is kind of a play of like tears or crying, which is, I think a big part of grief. And for me, has been a really difficult part of grief for me to be able to express. And oftentimes I have to kind of, I kind of have to play with the idea of crying, or I don't know if play is the right idea, but I know that I remember when I was younger, there were often times that I would wear glitter. And a big part of why I would wear glitter is that it would kind of, I don't know, it kind of helped me cope with the difficulties of life. It helped me feel like that could be what is seen first rather than potentially the pain or whatever. And then maybe we don't go there. I think that was an element of it. But I do recall very intentionally wearing glitter. I also wore glitter as a young person to deter people who might be sexually interested in me, which I think was really interesting. But I think that had to do with a little bit more of my own internalized transphobia and perceptions of femininity and attraction and all that crap. And I'm not sure why I shared that there, but I did. But glitter has been something that I've experienced, or sparkle is something I've experienced in different ways throughout my life. And so for me, sometimes it's really difficult for me to really sit with what I'm exactly grieving about. And sometimes it's helpful for something outside of myself to kind of inspire that, and or even to like work it out. And so for me, sometimes doing makeup or doing art is a way that I can express my sadness, express my loss, remember things that have been difficult for me to remember. Also, one of the things that I found really helpful, so crying was something that I learned to not cry as part of my conditioning growing up as somebody who was raised as a man, and crying. And in particular, I had a trauma response in which I cried a lot. And so I got to a point where I stunted my ability to cry, which stunted me from a lot of emotions, which is kind of like a whole other thing. But if you're kind of have that similar response with life and with grief, some of the things that I found helpful in that time of my life was watching certain films or television that could that kind of reminded me of my story and my challenge or my grief and my loss. I used to watch the movie Rent a lot, which I think Rent for a lot of people is maybe not an ideal like feel good, lift your spirit kind of film. But for me, that's what it was for some reason. And I think part of that is I really resonated with a lot of the characters as a person living with HIV. So the fact that they all had HIV, but there was also a lot of the songs and the words that were spoken to each other and the feelings and the emotions that were happening throughout the show really helped me to emote and connect with those parts of myself that I really was struggling to connect with, like say in the real world. And I can tend to do that more so, right? Even just now, I can say that I still kind of use that tool. I've been watching a lot of Pose. Pose is a TV show that has a lot of trans characters in it, and there's a lot of family dynamics as far as chosen family as well as the families that we're grown into. And a lot of the characters have difficulty with their families of origin and their families understanding them, and really struggling with being in their life with them, wanting to be in one another's lives, loving one another, but not really knowing how to do that. And so for me, it's helpful for me to see these characters and hear these characters and what they're going through, because then I feel less isolated in what it is that I'm going through. Like, I don't feel like I'm the only one in the world, which we all know better than that, but that's often sometimes what happens. And that's when like grief can kind of overtake me into a way in which I then shut off and I don't grieve at all. And that's really kind of like the challenge. I think I don't know that there is a right or wrong way for anything. Like I just don't use that language. You are the only one who is living your life, and you are the only one who has the perspective and the point of view of what you're actually going through with everything that's happened in your life up to this point. There's nobody who can tell you how you should, and this includes yourself even, how you should or shouldn't be responding to a particular situation. I think, oftentimes, like with everything else, it's about having a mindfulness or an awareness or the ability to not keep it a secret. I'm in recovery, as many of you know. And one of the phrases I've heard there, and I'm sure it's spoken outside of that, but that we're only as sick as our secrets. And the sickness is not the sense in recovery, it kind of refers to like our addiction. And our addiction oftentimes is not always like just the substances that we use. But like for me, I was a person who I struggled with feeling the way that I felt, and I couldn't deal with that. And so I needed something to kind of take me out of that feeling, which is what drugs and alcohol really came into play for. And so when I notice that when things are in the dark, when I am going through things and I am not able to talk with other people about it, then that is in the darkness. And me keeping things from other people is a sign that I am not coping well with what is happening in my life. And typically that usually has to do with shame. I have some sort of shame around what it is that I'm going through. Otherwise, I would probably be able to put light on it. And oftentimes my shame is not actually like the thing that happened, but maybe my inability to, or me feeling weak, or me feeling like I should be able to respond better or differently than I am. And those sorts of things can begin to fester in me, and begin to make me unwell, and unwell in the sense of just unable to really be aware of life, to show up with one another in a connected way, they say the opposite of addiction is connection. And I really believe that. And a big part of my staying sober and ability to stay clean and sober is my ability to work to connect with others, and there's been times in my life I've been better at it. There's been times when it's other people that I can connect with in order to be okay. um, there was a time in my life a few years ago where it was just like this God thing that I hoped to God was there, that I kind of connected with and communed with and had relationship in a way to cause me to have a positive effect with life and to soften the blow of life to where I can exist in it and move forward. And then the last little while, I've been learning how to connect with me more, uh, in order to kind of go through whatever it is that life is sending my way. And I'm noticing, like, in talking about grief and loss, it's like it's grief and loss is almost a part of a lot of really big things, because in some ways I'm like thinking like, oh, we're talking about going through difficult things, or I don't, but I guess that's grief and loss, right? It's grief and loss is when you lose something that you see the world, or you see a relationship, or you are in the world in a different new way, like something has to die. And so there is a grieving of what was to now what is. And obviously there's like different levels to all of that. um, if there are any other questions or comments, feel free to place them in the thing. I'm going to be going about 5 or 6 more minutes now. I just wanted to check my notes to see where I go. It's really interesting because I have like a long list of things that I was going to go through and talk about, and I think for me that's just part of the process of getting here. I really truly believe that, like, there's something powerful in just being able to express yourself, and say out loud what is going through your mind. I pray, and I connect with, and my intention is to speak to this in a way that is helpful for me, but also in a way that hopefully it can land on someone and be useful to them in some way. If my pain, if my struggle, if my victory, if my experience can some way help you through yours, it turns my difficult experience into an asset. It turns it into something that's useful rather than something that is just taking from my life. I was doing a tarot reading with a friend yesterday, and I don't really like. Yeah. Anyway, I was doing a tarot reading with a new friend, and uh, one of the things that it came up was a recent death, and it was about a year or so ago, and I think deaths are really interesting, and I think relationships in general, or the loss of relationships, our relationships really never end completely. Like, we still have a relationship with everyone. Like, I think as long as we breathe, we potentially are still in relationship with others. And sometimes that's just, it's different. If somebody isn't physically there, you're going to have a different relationship with them than when they are. And so I think one of the things that's really important and part of the healing process is, is to be able to be on the other end, in which I can have a relationship with this person that is no longer in my life, that reminds me and brings comfort in my life in the ways that maybe they had when we could be more closer, or we could be in a different sort of relationship. And so sometimes we have to reimagine how, or tap into how others have shown up for us in the past, in order to take that wisdom, in order to take that smile, in order to take that embrace into your current, like, situation and circumstance. And that's like the power of, I think, our mind and maybe our spirit and our emotions, is that ability for us to tap into something that was now, and have that similar effect on your body. And so and it's difficult to do because when we first lose something, all we can think about is the loss. All we can think about are the hateful, hurtful, harmful, like just the trauma of it all, the whatever's kind of tied to that loss, whether it's a death or the end of a relationship, which can be, I think, even more complicated. But once we're able to get past the point of the difficult aspects, or I won't even say like the ugly or the blemishes or the death of that relationship and that person, then we're able to kind of, potentially engage, if we so choose, and there's the ability, back into that relationship in a positive way that helps us. I think, for me, I do that around death and dying. There are a lot of people who've passed in my life that I don't know. I don't know where they are. I don't know if I actually can tap into them or if they have anything to do with my life now or not. However, I do know that when I interact with them, when I remember them, they are real to me. They're real in the way that they can be real. And in that means that they're still alive and they're still with me. And so being able to tap into that, like I know that like I have an ex, yeah, I don't know. I just have folks around me at times, or it's helpful for me to have conversations with people who are no longer in my life for whatever reason. And those conversations could just be, like in the mirror or in the shower, or sometimes it could just be around a candle or in prayer or in meditation, to invite that person, that situation into that moment. I think the big thing about grief is that you have to really just like take it on, and that's whether it's you yourself or going through it. Allow yourself grace, and you might have to go like in it and out of it, in and out of it, in the grief, and that's okay. Like that's part of the process. But I think it's just not something that you can avoid for forever. And we can do better when we can begin to start that process, because it's going to take some time. It's not linear. And it's not like there's not even a certain time frame for it. Grief is a very interesting part of ourselves, and part of our experience with being in relationship with one another. And so it kind of fluctuates all over the place. There are things that I still sometimes grieve from even like my childhood, and things that I couldn't even grieve then. So sometimes it has taken me. I couldn't grieve my childhood or even things of my younger years until I was, further along in life, to where I was at the point to where I had the capacity to get angry, to get sad, to point fingers, but then also to then be able to turn to compassion and understanding, and all of that sort of stuff, so that I'm not taken out by that, but actually I'm able to move with it. Yeah, and I'm right at that 33-minute mark. I don't know what I said, which sometimes can be good. But again, that's the kind of none of my business. I just show up. I share what's on my heart and my mind, and I speak it. And I hope that somebody at some point in time can get some sort of connection through this experience. And so if you're going through grief, I feel you. And yeah, just try to show up for one another in your grief, whether it's for yourself. Try to be able to share it and talk with others about it. If you are a person who can show up for others in their life about their grief, I think it's important to be able to, in listening to that podcast, one of the things that stood out, and in this experience that I had with this person during this tarot reading yesterday, was one of the things that I found interesting is when people talk about the grief or loss, I think oftentimes we just don't talk about it anymore. We just because we don't want to say, well, what happened, or tell me about whatever. And I think that's what we need to try to do is cautiously and mindfully with this person, I was able to ask, like, well, what was his name? And then I was able to refer to him by name the rest of the conversation. And I asked, like, what was it about him that you liked, or tell me more about his life. And then again, I think when we can get an opportunity to speak about these things that we no longer have in our lives, we can begin to have a more real and authentic connection and understanding of it in a way that can help us move forward, and with the lessons and the teachings and the strength and the sparkly shit and the stuff that don't sparkle, to move along. So I've went a couple minutes longer than I like to do. Join me next week, same time, same place. You can watch this live on YouTube on Sundays at 3:33 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, or you can watch anytime you like on YouTube, or you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts at A Queer Chaplain. Take care. Have a lovely Memorial weekend, and talk with you soon. Also, don't ever hesitate to direct message me or reach out to me if you'd like to get tea or be in conversation. Love you. Bye-bye.
I've been waiting all my life for something. I've been down the darkest roads and